Peak oil means that you have reached your highest sustainable supply. You peaked. And what peak oil generally portends is that after some fairly short period of being at peak oil, you start into a decline. It's like I mean, use Switzerland. You go into the Alps and you reach the peak. When you reach the peak, you're at the top of the mountain. Sometimes down the other side is very, very gradual slide, and other times down the other side is a fairly stiff. If you look at oil fields in the North Sea, for instance, virtually every great oil field in the North Sea peaked. Most of them, once they peaked, over the next decade had a decline of 40 to 80% in their daily production. Peak oil doesn't mean the single highest amount you can produce in a day, because there are lots of fields around the world that still have high reservoir pressures and so forth, so they're managing the productivity of that field by choking in the peak supply so that it intentionally doesn't peak. So if you went to a fire drill and said, okay, everybody has to produce everything we can, we could probably move peak oil forward, and we would have a far more dramatic decline also. So if you redefine peak oil as to not the peak month or peak year, but sustainable for a decade or even a half a decade, while we desperately rearrange our society, then I think there is a serious enough chance that it's already here. And if it isn't here, then it will be here between 2006 and 2012. It's really an interesting story, and it's a story that I certainly didn't pay any attention to until the last 3 or 4 years. I used to hear people occasionally talking about the Hubbert peak or the are you a peak oil guy? And I didn't have any idea what they were talking about. Then I finally read 2 or 3 interesting books about this interesting character, Dr. M. King Hubbert, Marion K. Hubbert, who was the senior scientist of Shell Oil Company. And as far as I can find, the first thing that he published as a serious paper was back in 1949 in Physics Today, observing the fact that it would seem that we had about another 50 years to be able to rely on fossil fuel before we were going to get into the other end of the spectrum and using fossil fuels of all type. He was talking about coal, natural gas, and oil would become harder to get out of the ground at high volumes. And in the and I don't know that anyone even paid attention to that at the time. His big peak oil debut that everyone that follows this remembers so vividly was in sometime in 1956. So next year we'll celebrate the 50th anniversary of when Dr. Hubbert spoke at, I believe it was the American Association of Petroleum Geologists, and he'd vetted this paper with the Shell senior management, and they hated him giving it. He said, no, don't go there. You're going to embarrass us. You're going to embarrass yourself. And he just went ahead and gave the paper anyway. And he said that from all of the research he'd done, that given the known reserve base in the United States of America, that it seemed to him that in the early 70s, the U.S. would peak. And once we peaked in oil production, we would go into an irreversible decline. And it didn't matter how many wells we drilled, we would go into irreversible decline. And interestingly enough, by 1970, I've actually gone back and read 2 or 3 of the magazines at the time. There were people quite smugly observing this. Remember that old coot, or remember that old crank from Shell Oil Company who was warning that in the early 70s we were going to run out of oil? Give me a break. We have never produced more the year we peaked. Because one thing about peaking is it sets a record. And what's really interesting and a little bit disquieting when you think about, United States had been the largest oil producer on earth for almost 100 years. And nobody thought we'd ever peak. Or the people that did thought it was basically 20, 30 years away, other than this one crank scientist. It turns out that in December 1970, the U.S., and this is nothing to do with Alaska, this is nothing to do with deep water. It was the U.S. production base, peaked at 10.2 million barrels a day, and then oil prices went through the roof. We went on a drilling boom of epic proportion. 10 years later, we were drilling and completing 4.5 times more oil wells than we were doing back when we peaked. And our domestic oil production from the lower 48 and the shallow waters of the Intercontinental Shelf had already declined from 10.2 million barrels a day to 6.9 million barrels a day. What I find really interesting is, had we not had that drilling boom, we probably could have been at 4 million barrels a day. So it also points out that once you peak, you need to exponentially increase your rate of drilling to try to stabilize the decline. Well, interestingly enough, if you go back and look at U.S. petroleum history, most people actually missed the fact that it happened. The drilling boom was going on. People were in such a frenzy. Alaska, we were trying to get it on stream. We didn't know whether there were going to be 1 or 2 or 3 Prudhoe bays in Alaska. And then by the early 80s, we thought we had a massive worldwide glut. So I actually think, ironically, peaking of oil in 1970 didn't serve any kind of history lesson. And then in the late 90s, Dr. Campbell and John Larare and 2 or 3 of these scientists started publishing articles saying it would appear that the world is starting to approach peak oil. And economists went berserk. I think maybe the turning point was when Scientific American published a cover story called "The End of Cheap Oil." I think that's the first time I ever heard of Dr. Campbell's name. And I read the article. I thought, this is a pretty simple thing to read. It doesn't sound terribly illogical. If it's been 30 years, if we've been living more oil consumed every year than we found for 30 years, I guess it's inevitable that sooner or later we were going to reach that. But then I couldn't understand why so many economists were so savagely attacking this guy as a nutcase. Still don't. First of all, none of the people I know, and certainly I haven't, ever claimed that we're running out of oil. So that's the first thing that's interesting, is that the people who scoff the loudest at peak oil do not understand what the concept is they consistently say, these people talking about we're running out of oil. I mean, yeah, we're consuming 85 million barrels a day. I think 10 years from now we'll probably be consuming, pick a number, 75 or 60 million barrels a day. If you say it's 50 million barrels a day, you can't have run out if you're using something to the tune of 50 million barrels a day. So that's the first argument, is they keep trotting out, all these alarmists have always said we're running out of oil, but we never run out. That's true. We never will run out. The second thing is that there's an argument made that, in the early 1970s, people got all disturbed about the fact that we were running short of oil. The reason we got disturbed about it is we had a tiny amount of spare capacity. We had Arab oil embargo, and it created massive shortages, because the minute you have demand at 102% and supply at 100%, after you use up your global stocks, you have a shortage. And the shortage sent prices going through. And people started saying, oh my gosh, it looks like we're running out of oil. And so then when prices finally collapsed, totally discredited all the people that got shrewd. So here we are in 2005, and all these people started saying, just like we did in 1970. And I listen to that and I say many times, wake up. The differences between 1970 and 2005 were so profound. Start with the fact that in 70, early 70s, over half the globe essentially didn't use any oil. And the only serious oil consumers in 1970 were Europe, not an awful lot of Japan, the United States, Canada, and the former Soviet Union. Africa didn't use any oil in volume. Middle East didn't use any oil. None of Asia used any oil other than China. I mean, Japan. So we have a totally different demand picture today than we had in the 70s. Today, Papua New Guinea hardly uses any oil. There's probably 2 or 3 islands in the South Pacific that don't use any oil. Everybody else is hooked on trying to create a society that looks like us, whether it's us in the United States or us in Sweden. So that's the first enormous difference. The second difference is that our Middle East oil supplies, for instance, which was supposed to be the bountiful, sort of cornucopia of oil that would last forever, the great fields in the Middle East weren't terribly old fields in 1970. 95% of all the oil in the Middle East still comes from those same fields, and they happen to be 35 years older. And nothing of any significance has been found in the Middle East since 1970. So that's a huge difference. I don't think it's an issue that has captured the imagination and attention of most of the senior management of these oil and gas companies. I mean, to give them credit, they're really distracted by running a big company and managing the we have a board meeting coming up, and we have a budget meeting coming up, and so forth, and I'm not picking on anybody individually, but it's not an industry that's just chock full of a lot of readers. I've had so many friends in the industry say, "Man, alive, I wish I had the time you have, so I could actually read as much as you do." Well, I just love to read. I'm not a golfer, a player, so that's sort of been my hobby. If you haven't actually got into why the issue is serious, I think it's pretty easy if you're running an oil company to say, none of that couldn't happen. First of all, if I acknowledged it did, maybe our shareholders would think our company's obsolete, and I would certainly hate them to think that. And so in an accidental way, there's sort of a patent endorsement that the issue's junk science. In the Caspian, which actually isn't a new oil area at all, it was actually the great oil area of the 1880s, 1890s, but when Russia collapsed and they opened up the West, the Caspian for a decade was going to be the Middle East replaced. The Caspian Sea would replace the Persian Gulf. And I remember giving talks about I would show the picture of the one semi-submersible that was in the Caspian and say it's really hard to flood the world with oil when you have one offshore rig. Now they've had a string of dry holes that I believe the number is something like 25 of the last 30 exploratory wells drilled were dry. There's a big restoration project in the Caspian coming on in dribs and drabs that might work, might not work. There's one of the most expensive energy projects the world's ever done, Kashagan, which is in the very eastern end of the Caspian Sea, that's so attractive that that 3 of the original partners have dropped out. Because I guess they just didn't want too many attractive projects. They happen to be British Gas, BP, and Statoil, who collectively sold their shares of Kashagan for an enterprise value of about $4 to $5 billion. So for some reason, they didn't think it was the best project ever. Well, if you look at the newest numbers on Kashagan, its development cost is now somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 billion to maybe $60 billion. $1 billion in Kazakhstan. It's a very complicated reservoir, a series of reservoirs, and not very high quality oil. If it all works, it's supposed to come on stream in the first oil at about 70